The gentle creaking of her porch swing had always been Mrs. Thompson's favorite sound in the world. At 72, she had spent countless afternoons on this very porch, watching the neighborhood change and grow around her cherished home in Oakland. The Victorian-style house, with its weathered blue paint and white trim, had been her family's pride for over 40 years, purchased back when the neighborhood was a different place entirely. That Wednesday afternoon seemed like any other at first. The September breeze carried the sweet scent of her neighbor's blooming jasmine, and her china teacup clinked softly against its saucer as she enjoyed her daily ritual of chamomile tea and honey cookies. She had just finished watering her beloved row of potted geraniums, their bright red blooms adding cheerful splashes of color to the porch railings. Mrs. Thompson smiled as she watched the Johnson kids from across the street playing hopscotch, that laughter floating up to her porch. She remembered when her own children had played those same games, right there on the sidewalk. The neighborhood had changed so much since then, with new faces moving in and old friends moving away, but her porch had remained her constant sanctuary. She was just reaching for her crossword puzzle, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose, when she noticed an unfamiliar car slowly cruising down her street. The vehicle passed by once, then twice, before finally stopping in front of her house. Two police officers stepped out, and something about their purposeful stride made her heart skip a beat. "Ma'am, we've received a call about a suspicious person on this property," the taller officer announced without introduction, his hand resting casually on his belt as he climbed the first few steps of her porch. His partner, a younger officer, hung back slightly, scanning the porch with narrowed eyes. Mrs. Thompson felt her throat tighten, but 40 years of teaching middle school had taught her how to maintain composure in tense situations. "Officers," she said calmly, setting down her teacup with a steady hand, "I'm not sure I understand. This is my home. I've lived here since 1981. The younger officer stepped forward, his notepad already in hand. "We'll need to see some identification and proof of residence, ma'am." His tone made the polite words sound anything but courteous. "Of course," Mrs. Thompson replied, keeping her voice level despite the tremor she felt in her hands. "My driver's license is in my purse, just inside the door. Would you like me to get it for you?" She began to rise slowly from her porch swing, her arthritis making the movement more difficult than usual, or perhaps it was the tension of the moment that made her joints extra stiff. "Stay where you are," the taller officer commanded sharply, causing Mrs. Thompson to sink back into her seat. The porch swing swayed slightly with the sudden movement, its familiar creak now sounding more like a protest. Through her front window, she could see her framed family photos on the wall, graduation pictures, wedding portraits, snapshots of grandchildren's birthday parties. 40 years of memories stared back at her through the glass, while outside, she was being treated like an intruder in her own home. Mrs. Thompson thought about Mrs. Chen next door, who always brought her fresh vegetables from her garden, and Mr. Rodriguez across the street, who helped clear her sidewalk every winter. They had been neighbors for decades. Surely someone would notice what was happening and step out to verify her story. But the street had grown oddly quiet. The Johnson children had disappeared inside, and the only sound was the continued creaking of her porch swing and the occasional crackle of the officer's radios. Her tea was growing cold in its delicate china cup, a wedding gift from her late husband, and the afternoon sun that had felt so warm and comforting just moments ago now seemed harsh and exposing. She could feel the weight of the officer's suspicious stares, but she held herself with dignity, just as she had taught her students to do in the face of adversity. Her mind went to her son, now a successful attorney downtown. He had always told her to stay calm in situations like this and to know her rights. With careful movements, she reached for her phone, which lay next to her crossword puzzle. "What are you reaching for?" the younger officer demanded, taking a step forward. The sudden sharpness in his voice made Mrs. Thompson's hand freeze midway to her phone. In that moment, the gentle September breeze carried the scent of her jasmine plant, a reminder of the peaceful afternoon that had turned so wrong so quickly. Her porch, her sanctuary for 4 decades, had suddenly become the stage for a scene she had hoped her neighborhood had moved beyond. But Mrs. Thompson knew that what happened next would matter not just for her, but for her community. With quiet determination, she steadied her voice and prepared to stand her ground, dignity intact, just as she had taught countless students to do over her years in the classroom. The sound of a car door slamming in the distance caught everyone's attention, and Mrs. Thompson felt a wave of relief wash over her. Help was coming, and this story was far from over. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Mrs. Thompson's porch as the confrontation continued to unfold. Her teacup sat forgotten, its contents now cold, while the two officers maintained their intimidating stance. The taller officer had moved to block the porch steps, his body language making it clear that no one was going anywhere until he was satisfied. "Listen, ma'am," he said, his tone carrying that false patience that made Mrs. Thompson's skin crawl. "We're just doing our job. Someone reported suspicious activity, and we need to investigate." He pulled out his notepad, flipping it open with practiced efficiency. "How long did you say you've been here today?" Mrs. Thompson smoothed her floral dress over her knees, a habit she'd developed during her decades of teaching when trying to maintain patience. "Officer, as I explained, I live here. I've been sitting on this porch almost every afternoon for the past 40 years. She gestured to the carefully tended flowers lining the porch rails. "Those geraniums didn't plant themselves, you know." The younger officer stepped closer, his boots heavy on the wooden planks. "Ma'am, we're going to need more than stories about flowers. Do you have any documentation? Property papers? Utility bills?" Mrs. Thompson felt her heart racing, but her voice remained steady. Years of handling difficult parent-teacher conferences had taught her the value of staying composed. "Young man, my property deed is inside, along with 40 years of tax receipts and every utility bill since 1981. But I shouldn't need to prove my right to sit on my own porch." Through her peripheral vision, she noticed movement behind the officers. Mrs. Chen, her neighbor of 35 years, had appeared on her own porch next door. The elderly Asian woman stood watching, her hand clutching her phone, concern etched deeply on her face. Their eyes met briefly, and Mrs. Thompson gave a slight nod, a silent acknowledgement between two women who had seen their neighborhood through both good times and bad. The taller officer's radio crackled to life, breaking the tension momentarily. As he turned slightly to respond, Mrs. Thompson seized the opportunity to reach for her phone again. This time, her arthritis-stiffened fingers managed to grasp it before the younger officer's sharp voice cut through the air. "Ma'am, put the phone down. Keep your hands where we can see them." His command drew the attention of his partner, who turned back quickly, hand moving instinctively toward his belt. Mrs. Thompson's heart pounded, but she kept her phone firmly in her grasp. "Officer, I have every right to call my son. He's an attorney downtown, and he needs to know what's happening here." The mention of her son being an attorney caused a subtle shift in the officer's demeanor. The partners exchanged a quick glance, but neither backed down. Instead, the taller one stepped closer, his shadow falling across her lap. "Ma'am, we can handle this situation without involving any attorneys. Just show us some ID, and we can clear this up quickly." His tone had shifted from false patience to barely concealed irritation. Mrs. Thompson thought about all the times she taught her students about their rights, about standing up for themselves while staying safe. Now, sitting on her own porch, she was living those lessons. She straightened her back, ignoring the familiar ache that had settled there over the years. "Officers, I understand you're doing your job," she said, her teacher's voice coming through, the one that had quieted rowdy classrooms for decades. "But I'm doing what any citizen should do when their rights are being questioned. I'm calling my son." As she began to dial, more neighbors emerged from their homes. Mr. Rodriguez stood at his front gate, arms crossed, watching intently. The Johnson family peered through their window. Even old Mr. Baker, who rarely left his house anymore, had stepped onto his porch 3 doors down. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, noticing the growing audience. "Ma'am, we've received a credible complaint." "From who?" Mrs. Thompson interrupted, her patience finally wearing thin. "From someone who doesn't know that I've hosted the neighborhood watch meetings on this very porch for 20 years. Someone who hasn't seen me tend these flowers every spring or shovel this walkway every winter." The sound of a car engine gunning in the distance made everyone turn. A sleek black sedan was speeding down the street, moving with purpose. Mrs. Thompson felt relief flood through her body. She recognized that car. The cavalry was arriving, and these officers were about to learn an important lesson about assumptions and respect. The taller officer must have sensed the shift in the atmosphere. He took a step back, though his hand remained near his belt. The younger one glanced nervously at the gathering crowd of neighbors, then at the approaching car, clearly realizing that this routine call was about to become anything but routine. Mrs. Thompson simply sat straighter in her porch swing, its gentle creaking a reminder of all the storms, both literal and figurative, it had weathered with her. This particular storm was about to take an interesting turn, and she was ready for whatever came next. A lifetime of experience had taught Mrs. Thompson that dignity was often the strongest response to disrespect. As she sat on her porch, surrounded by the life she had built over 4 decades, she drew upon that inner strength. The cold tea in her favorite china cup, the unfinished crossword puzzle, and her carefully tended flowers all stood as silent witnesses to the absurdity of having to defend her presence on her own property. The gathering crowd of neighbors had created an unexpected shift in the atmosphere. Mrs. Chen had quietly made her way closer, now standing at the bottom of her own porch steps, still holding her phone up. Mr. Rodriguez had moved from his gate to the sidewalk, his weathered face set in a concerned frown. Even Mrs. Peterson, who usually kept to herself, had emerged from her house across the street. Officers, Mrs. Thompson spoke, her voice carrying the same calm authority she had used to control unruly classrooms for 35 years. I've spent my entire career teaching young people about respect, dignity, and doing what's right. I've lived in this house since before either of you started kindergarten. She paused, letting her words sink in. I've seen this neighborhood through good times and bad, and I've never had to prove my right to exist in my own space. The younger officer shifted his weight uncomfortably, perhaps finally sensing the weight of the moment. His partner, however, maintained his rigid stance. Ma'am, we still need to see some identification. And you will? Mrs. Thompson interrupted, her tone firm but not angry. But first, I'd like you both to look around. Look at these neighbors who have come out of their homes. Ask any of them who I am. She gestured to her porch. Look at these flowers. Would someone who doesn't belong here take the time to nurture a garden? Look at those wind chimes. My students gave them to me when I retired 10 years ago. A gentle breeze stirred those very wind chimes, their soft melody providing an almost musical backdrop to her words. The sound seemed to ease some of the tension in the air, though the officers remained stationed on her porch steps. Mrs. Thompson continued, her voice taking on the tone she had used countless times to teach important life lessons. You know, in my 40 years of teaching, I learned that sometimes the most valuable lessons come from moments like these. Moments when we're forced to examine our assumptions and ask ourselves hard questions. She reached for her phone again, this time more deliberately. The younger officer started to protest, but she held up her other hand. A gesture that had stopped countless classroom disruptions in their tracks. I'm going to show you something, she said, pulling up her photo gallery. These are pictures from last month's neighborhood watch meeting, right here on this very porch. The photos showed a diverse group of neighbors, including several police officers from the local precinct, all gathered around her porch. Plates of cookies were visible on the small table where her cold tea now sat, and familiar faces from the current crowd of onlookers could be spotted in the images. Every month for 20 years, we've hosted these meetings, she explained, swiping through the photos. Working together with law enforcement to keep our community safe. The irony of this situation would be amusing if it weren't so concerning. A car door slammed nearby. Her son's arrival was imminent. But Mrs. Thompson wasn't finished making her point. She turned her attention back to the officers, her gaze direct but not confrontational. Young men, I've spent my life teaching children that the police are here to protect and serve all members of our community. I've always believed that most officers live up to that ideal. Today, you have an opportunity to prove me right. The growing crowd of neighbors had created a palpable sense of community support. Someone had started recording the scene on their phone. Others stood in silent solidarity. The afternoon sun continued its slow descent, casting long shadows across the porch, but Mrs. Thompson sat tall and composed in her porch swing. The sound of confident footsteps approaching up the sidewalk made both officers turn. Mrs. Thompson's son, still in his courtroom suit, was walking purposefully toward the porch. His briefcase swung in one hand, and his expression was a perfect mixture of professional calm and barely contained outrage. The taller officer's hand still rested near his belt, but there was uncertainty in his stance now. The younger one had taken a small step back, perhaps finally understanding the magnitude of their mistake. The neighborhood had become incredibly quiet, with only the gentle tinkling of wind chimes and the soft creak of the porch swing breaking the silence. Mrs. Thompson felt a surge of pride as she watched her son approach. Not just pride in the successful attorney he had become, but pride in the lesson that was about to unfold. Sometimes, she knew, the most powerful teaching moments came not from a classroom, but from real-life situations like this, moments that tested our character and showed us who we truly were. The afternoon light caught the polish of her son's dress shoes as he climbed the first step of the porch. His presence seemed to fill the space with a new kind of energy, not angry or aggressive, but powerfully focused. The silk tie he wore was one Mrs. Thompson had given him for passing the bar exam, and seeing it now felt like a sign of destiny. "Good afternoon, officers," he said, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone who had argued hundreds of cases in court. "I'm Mrs. Thompson's son, and I'm also an attorney with the Civil Rights Division downtown." He placed his briefcase carefully on the porch railing. The sound of its metal clasps clicking open seemed unusually loud in the tense silence. The taller officer straightened his posture, clearly reassessing the situation. "Sir, we're responding to a call about a suspicious person on this property," her son interrupted smoothly, already pulling out his phone. "Yes, I heard that part during my mother's call. What I'd like to hear now is your probable cause for detaining a 72-year-old woman on her own property." He began recording with his phone, his movements deliberate and practiced. Mrs. Thompson watched with quiet pride as her son took control of the situation. She remembered all those nights he'd studied at the kitchen table, all those mock trials she'd helped him practice for. Now here he was, using that knowledge to protect her, just as she had protected him all those years. "We're not detaining anyone," the younger officer protested, though he had taken another step back. "We're just investigating a complaint." "Really?" Her son raised an eyebrow, his courtroom demeanor in full effect. "So my mother was free to go inside her house at any time? Because that's not what the neighbors' videos show." He gestured to the growing crowd, several of whom were indeed recording the scene. "What I see is two officers intimidating an elderly woman who was simply enjoying her afternoon tea on her own porch." The wind chimes tinkled softly, almost like they were providing punctuation to his words. Mrs. Thompson noticed Mrs. Chen nodding vigorously from her spot near the garden, while Mr. Rodriguez had moved closer to the steps, his arms still crossed but now with a slight smile of satisfaction on his face. "Now," her son continued, pulling out a small notebook, "I'd like your badge numbers, please. And the name of your supervising officer." His pen hovered over the paper, waiting. When the officers hesitated, he added, "Or we could discuss this down at the station with the chief. I had dinner with him and his wife just last weekend at the charity gala." The mention of the police chief caused a visible reaction in both officers. The taller one finally moved his hand away from his belt, reaching instead for his own notebook. "Sir, we were just following protocol." "Protocol." Her son's voice remained calm but took on an edge that Mrs. Thompson recognized from his biggest court victories. "Please explain which protocol requires officers to harass a longtime resident without proper investigation. Which protocol suggests threatening a grandmother for reaching for her phone? Which protocol overlooks 40 years of community involvement in favor of an anonymous complaint?" He paused, letting his questions hang in the air. The gathered neighbors had grown so quiet that the creaking of the porch swing seemed thunderous as Mrs. Thompson shifted slightly. She watched her son, remembering the little boy who used to play lawyer with his stuffed animals, now standing tall in defense of justice. "I'll tell you what we're going to do," he continued, his tone shifting to something more constructive. "First, you're both going to apologize to my mother. Then, we're going to have a conversation with your supervisor about proper community policing procedures. Finally, we're going to identify whoever made this complaint and discuss the legal consequences of false reports." Mrs. Thompson noticed the younger officer glancing at his partner, uncertainty clear on his face. The taller officer seemed to be weighing his options, his earlier bravado replaced by something that looked like genuine reflection. "And one more thing," her son added, his voice softening slightly as he moved to stand beside her porch swing. "You're going to learn something today about judgment and respect. My mother spent 40 years teaching children about those values. She shouldn't have to teach them to police officers, but here we are. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the porch. The same porch where Mrs. Thompson had taught her son to read, where she'd consoled him after his father passed, where she'd celebrated his law school graduation. Now it had become the stage for another kind of teaching moment, one that might help prevent other families from experiencing similar situations. She reached out and patted her son's hand, feeling the familiar warmth of his strength combined with the new power of his professional authority. The simple gesture seemed to remind everyone present that beneath the legal confrontation, this was ultimately about family, community, and the basic right to feel safe in one's own home. The wind chimes sang their gentle song again, and Mrs. Thompson noticed both officers finally lowering their defensive postures. Change was coming to her porch today, and she could feel in her heart that it would reach far beyond her front steps. The transformation on Mrs. Thompson's porch was remarkable to witness. Her son, every inch the skilled attorney, had pulled out his laptop from his briefcase and set it on the small table where her forgotten tea still sat. The two officers now stood at a respectful distance, their earlier aggression replaced by attentive professionalism. "Let's review what happened here today," her son began, his fingers moving swiftly across the keyboard. "According to my mother's account and these witness videos, you responded to a suspicious person call without first checking property records or speaking with neighbors." He looked up, his expression firm but not unkind. "That's not just poor policing. It's a potential violation of several civil rights statutes." The younger officer cleared his throat. "Sir, we apologize for any distress." "Don't apologize to me," her son interrupted, gesturing toward Mrs. Thompson. "Apologize to my mother, who spent her afternoon being treated like a criminal on her own property." Mrs. Thompson watched as both officers turned to face her. The taller one removed his cap, a gesture that reminded her of her own students when they knew they'd done wrong and were ready to make amends. "Mrs. Thompson," the taller officer began, his voice notably softer than before, "we sincerely apologize for our behavior today. We should have handled this situation differently." He paused, seeming to struggle with his next words. "My own grandmother, she would be so ashamed of how I acted today." The younger officer stepped forward. "Ma'am, I'm sorry too. When I was in the academy, they taught us about community policing, but today I forgot those lessons. There's no excuse for how we treated you." Mrs. Thompson nodded, seeing the genuine regret in their faces. "You know," she said, smoothing her dress as she had done countless times during difficult parent-teacher conferences, "in my 40 years of teaching, I learned that mistakes can be our greatest teachers if we're willing to learn from them." Her son had been typing throughout the exchange, documenting everything. "Here's what happens next," he said, turning his laptop screen to show a formal complaint form. "I'm filing an official report about this incident. Not to punish you," he added, seeing their concerned expressions, "but to ensure proper training and protocols are put in place." The sound of another car approaching drew everyone's attention. A police supervisor's vehicle pulled up, responding to the call her son had made earlier. The gathered neighbors watched as a senior officer, his uniform adorned with captain's bars, made his way up the walkway. "Captain," her son greeted, standing to shake his hand. "Thank you for coming. We have an opportunity here to make some real changes in community policing procedures." Mrs. Thompson watched as her porch transformed into an impromptu meeting space. Her son pulled up another chair for the captain, while Mrs. Chen from next door brought over a fresh pot of tea. The officers who had initially caused such distress now sat attentively as her son outlined a comprehensive plan for community engagement and cultural sensitivity training. "What we need," her son explained, "is a bridge between law enforcement and the community. And my mother's porch might just be the perfect place to build it." He turned to Mrs. Thompson with a knowing smile. "Mom, remember how you always hosted those student-teacher conferences to resolve conflicts? What if we did something similar here?" Mrs. Thompson felt warmth spread through her chest as she understood what her son was suggesting. "Monthly community dialogues," she said, nodding, "right here on this porch. Police officers and neighbors, sharing concerns, building understanding." The captain leaned forward, clearly interested. "That could be very valuable for our department. Mrs. Thompson, your experience as an educator could help guide these conversations." The younger officer, who had been quietly listening, suddenly spoke up. "I'd like to be part of that if I could. Today showed me how much I still need to learn." The afternoon light had softened to early evening, casting a gentle glow over the gathering. The neighbors who had come out in support were now engaged in quiet conversations among themselves, sharing their own stories and experiences. What had started as a confrontation was transforming into something hopeful. Mrs. Thompson's wind chimes tinkled softly in the evening breeze, and she smiled at the familiar sound. Her porch had always been a place of learning and growth, first for her children, then for her students who would visit after school, and now, perhaps, for an entire community. Her son was now showing the captain specific sections of civil rights law on his laptop, while the two officers who had started this whole incident were engaged in earnest conversation with Mr. Rodriguez about his experiences in the neighborhood. The scene before her was exactly what she had spent her life working toward: people from different backgrounds coming together, learning from each other, making positive changes. She picked up her teacup, now filled with fresh tea from Mrs. Chen, and took a satisfying sip. Sometimes, she thought, the most powerful classrooms aren't found in schools at all. Sometimes they're found on front porches, where life's most important lessons unfold in unexpected ways. As the evening sun painted the sky in soft oranges and pinks, Mrs. Thompson's porch had become more than just a gathering place. It had transformed into a symbol of community strength. Neighbors who had initially come out to witness a confrontation were now actively participating in what felt like a neighborhood revival meeting. Mrs. Chen had brought out her famous almond cookies, arranging them carefully next to the tea set. Mr. Rodriguez was sharing stories about his 30 years in the neighborhood with the young police officers, who now sat listening with genuine interest. The transformation in their demeanor was remarkable, from intimidating presence to engaged community members in the span of a few hours. "You know," Mrs. Thompson said, addressing the growing crowd from her porch swing, "when I first moved here in 1981, this neighborhood was very different. But one thing has remained the same: the power of people coming together." She paused, looking at the faces around her, each one representing a different chapter in her community's story. The police captain, who had been taking notes on his department-issued pad, looked up with interest. "Mrs. Thompson, would you be willing to share your perspective at our next department training session? I think our officers could learn a lot from your experiences." Before she could respond, a young woman stepped forward from the crowd. She lived in one of the newly built apartments down the street and had moved in just months ago. "Mrs. Thompson," she said, her voice slightly trembling with emotion, "I've been feeling like an outsider since I moved here. But watching everything that happened today, it's shown me what this community really stands for." The younger police officer, who had earlier demanded Mrs. Thompson's ID, now stood up. "Ma'am, if you're willing, I'd like to bring some of our rookie officers to these community meetings you're planning. What happened today? Well, it's the kind of lesson they should learn in the academy, but sometimes it takes a real-world experience to truly understand." Mrs. Thompson's son had been quietly documenting everything on his laptop, but now he closed it and addressed the gathering. "What we're seeing here is exactly how positive change happens, not through confrontation alone, but through understanding and action." A local church leader who lived 3 houses down raised his hand. "We could make this a regular thing, not just monthly meetings but weekly community gatherings. Share food, stories, concerns, build real connections between law enforcement and residents." The enthusiasm was contagious. Soon, neighbors were pulling out their phones, creating a community group chat. Others were discussing plans for a neighborhood newsletter. Even the teenagers, usually more interested in their phones than community events, were engaged, suggesting ways to use social media to spread awareness about the initiative. Mrs. Thompson watched it all unfold from her porch swing, her heart full of hope. The incident that could have ended so differently had become a catalyst for something beautiful. She thought about all the students she'd taught over the years, how she'd always told them that every challenge was an opportunity for growth. Now, her own experience was proving that lesson true. The police captain was now engaged in a serious discussion with her son about implementing new training protocols. They talked about body cameras, community engagement strategies, and the importance of cultural sensitivity. But more importantly, they were talking about human dignity and respect, the foundations of any meaningful change. "Mom," her son said, turning to her with a smile, Remember how you always said your porch was your favorite classroom? Looks like you're about to have your biggest class yet." Mrs. Thompson chuckled, the sound mixing with the gentle evening breeze. "Teaching never really ends," she said, looking around at the impromptu community gathering. "We just find new ways to share the lessons." As if to emphasize her point, the young officer who had earlier been so confrontational was now helping Mrs. Chen distribute her cookies, engaging in animated conversation with the neighbors. The transformation wasn't just in his actions, it was in his understanding. You could see it in his eyes, in the way he truly listened to each person who spoke. The evening air had grown cooler, but nobody seemed eager to leave. Someone had brought out folding chairs from their garage, creating an informal circle on the lawn. Children who had earlier been hurried inside by worried parents now played safely under the watchful eyes of the entire community. The scene was a living testament to what could happen when fear was replaced by understanding. A young reporter from the local newspaper had arrived, drawn by social media posts about the incident. But instead of finding a story about conflict, she discovered one about community growth and the power of turning negative situations into positive change. "This isn't just a neighborhood meeting," Mrs. Thompson told the reporter, her voice carrying the wisdom of her years. "This is what real community policing looks like. This is how we build trust, one conversation at a time, one person at a time, one day at a time." The wind chimes sang softly in agreement, their melody a gentle reminder that sometimes the most powerful changes start in the most ordinary places, like a grandmother's front porch on what had started as just another quiet afternoon. 3 months had passed since that transformative afternoon on Mrs. Thompson's porch, and the changes in the community were remarkable. The simple wooden swing where she had faced down prejudice had become a symbol of progress, and her front porch had transformed into something she'd never imagined, a true center of community change. On this particular Sunday afternoon, Mrs. Thompson sat in her familiar spot, watching as people gathered for what had become a weekly tradition. The police captain who had arrived that first day was now a regular visitor, often bringing new officers to meet community members in a relaxed, friendly setting. Mrs. T called out one of the rookie officers, a young woman who had just graduated from the academy. "I brought those photos from our community training session." She bounded up the porch steps, holding a small album. The photos showed Mrs. Thompson speaking to a room full of police officers, sharing her experiences and wisdom. The older woman smiled, remembering how nervous she'd been about that presentation. "You know," she said, accepting a cup of fresh tea from Mrs. Chen, "when I was still teaching, I always told my students that education happens everywhere. I never imagined I'd be teaching at the police academy." Her son, who had driven down for the weekly gathering, was engaged in conversation with several officers and neighbors about a new community outreach program they were developing. The legal documents he prepared that first day had led to department-wide changes in training and procedures, but more importantly, they had opened the door for real dialogue. "Mom," he called out, waving a newspaper, "have you seen this?" He climbed the porch steps and handed her the local paper. There, on the front page, was a photo of her porch, filled with people of all ages and backgrounds, under the headline, "Local Grandmother's Porch Becomes Blueprint for Community Policing Reform." Mrs. Thompson adjusted her reading glasses and smiled at the article. It detailed how her experience had sparked a movement that was spreading to other neighborhoods, other precincts. The reporter had captured the essence of what made these gatherings special, not just the formal changes in police procedure, but the human connections being built. The young officer who had been so confrontational on that first day was now one of the program's strongest advocates. He stood chatting with Mr. Rodriguez about the Neighborhood Watch program they'd revamped together. "It's amazing," he was saying, "how much better we can serve the community when we actually know the community." Children played freely on the lawn, their laughter mixing with the sound of adult conversations and Mrs. Thompson's wind chimes. Parents no longer hurried them inside when police cars drove by. Instead, the kids would wave, often knowing the officers by name. A group of teenagers who had initially been skeptical of any police interaction had started a youth advisory council. They met right there on Mrs. Thompson's porch, sharing their perspectives and concerns with officers who now listened with genuine interest and respect. "You know what makes my heart happiest?" Mrs. Thompson said to Mrs. Chen, who had settled into the chair beside her. It's seeing how one difficult moment can lead to so much good. She gestured to the diverse group gathered on her lawn. Look at all these people, talking, sharing, understanding each other better. The police captain approached the porch, holding up a formal-looking document. Mrs. Thompson, I wanted you to be the first to know. The department has officially adopted the community engagement protocols we developed here. Your porch meetings are now part of our official training manual. Her son beamed with pride. See, Mom, all those years of teaching didn't end when you retired. Your classroom just got bigger. A news van pulled up across the street, the third one this month. Word had spread about the Porch Talks, as they'd come to be known, and other communities were interested in implementing similar programs. Mrs. Thompson had already received calls from neighboring cities asking for advice on starting their own community dialogue initiatives. Mrs. Thompson called the young reporter who had covered the story from the beginning. Would you say a few words about how this all started? She looked around at her porch, at the weathered swing that had supported her through so many moments, at the blooming geraniums that had witnessed the transformation, at the wind chimes that still sang their gentle song of welcome. It started, she said thoughtfully, with a moment of injustice that could have turned bitter. Instead, it became a lesson in how to make things better. The gathered crowd nodded in agreement. Many of them had been there that first day, had seen the fear and tension transform into understanding and cooperation. They had all become part of something bigger than themselves, a real change in how their community worked together. As the afternoon sun began to set, casting its warm glow over the gathering, Mrs. Thompson felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Her porch had always been her favorite place to watch the world go by, but now it had become something more. A place where the world came together to grow, to learn, and to build a better future. The wind chimes tinkled softly in the evening breeze, their familiar sound now carrying a new meaning. They no longer just marked the passage of time on a grandmother's porch. They rang out a message of hope, of change, and of the power of community to transform even the darkest moments into opportunities for growth and understanding.